Welcome to class, everyone. My name is Dr. Clejo, and we'll begin our series of lectures on language teaching methodology. Today will be an introduction. We'll have a look at a brief history of developments in different language teaching methodologies that are available. Okay, so what we'll do today is we'll look at different approaches, methods, and techniques related to language teaching methodology. And then also have a look at why we need different approaches and methods, or why these different approaches and methods have been developed over the past several decades. And we'll have a look at the history of developments in these different methods. Okay, first of all, let's have a look at definitions of approach, method, and technique. All right, let's have a look at this diagram here. So the large circle represents approach. It's a set of assumptions and beliefs dealing with the nature of language learning and teaching. And within approach, we see different methods. And a method is an overall plan for systematic presentation of language based upon a selected approach. So after you have selected approach, you select a method, and within method, there are different techniques. These are specific activities that are manifested in the classroom and are consistent with the method, and therefore are in harmony with the approach as well. So the technique is in harmony with method, and the method is also in harmony with the approach that you have chosen. Okay, and let's also define what method is. Method is an umbrella term or the overall picture for the specification and inner relation of theory and practice. And we can divide the method into three different dimensions. There's approach, design, and procedure. Let's unpack one by one. Approach includes theories about the nature of language and language learning. And design is the general and specific objectives. And it includes a syllabus model and types of learning and teaching activities, and defines learner roles, teacher roles, and the role of instruction materials as well, for example, textbooks. And then we have procedure. It includes techniques and practices that are derived from one's approach and design. So after you have selected your approach and you have designed your curriculum, then comes procedure, or the techniques that you use. Okay, and here are some other definitions. So different linguists and educational theorists have defined these terms in different ways. So according to Brown, methodology refers to pedagogical practices in general. An approach is theoretically well-informed positions and beliefs about the nature of language, the nature of language learning, and the applicability of both to pedagogical settings. So Brown has provided definitions for more terms than the other theorists. Method is a generalized set of classroom specifications for accomplishing linguistic objectives. And then we have curriculum and syllabus. So these are the designs for carrying out a particular language program. So it includes how to conduct a particular lesson. And finally, technique. Any of a wide variety of exercises, activities, or tasks that are used in the language classroom for realizing lesson objectives. So could include activities, quizzes, or any exercises that you choose to include. Okay, so why do we need to study, or why do we need to look at approaches and methods? Let's see. The study of approaches and methods provides teachers with a view of how the field of language teaching has evolved and it forms part of the disciplinary knowledge expected of language teachers today. So it gives you an overview of developments in language teaching over the past decades. And it introduces teachers to the issues and options that are involved in planning and developing a language course. And it also introduces a variety of principles and procedures. I think these are very important, that teachers can review in relation to their own knowledge, beliefs, and practice. Okay, so here is an overview of the history of development in language teaching. So if we start from 1880, let's see, so the pre-method era, there was the direct method and grammar translation method. We'll have a look at these different methods in more detail later. And so that was from about 1880 to 1950. And in the 1950s, so from the middle of the 20th century up until, let's say, mid-1980s, we see development of various different methods. Thus, we have the methods era. It's called the methods era because, as you can see, so many methods were actually developed during this period. So these methods include the oral approach and situational language learning. There's also audiolingualism. And then from about mid-1960s, and it's actually continuing to the present day, communicative language teaching has been the dominant form of language teaching, the most widely accepted form of teaching currently. And during the methods era, we see different types of methods, as in total physical response, the silent way, suggestopedia, community language learning. It's easy to confuse community language learning with communicative language teaching. So this is CLL, communicative language teaching, CLT. And then there's the natural approach as well. And then there's the post-method era. So from about mid-80s to the present time, the contemporary era, there are different methods, including cooperative learning, content-based learning, task-based learning, and the lexical approach. So we'll have a look at these different methods in our lecture later. Okay, let's have a look at the brief history of developments in language methodology. All right, so due to the influence of Latin, the dominant language of education, commerce, religion, and government in the Western world, the study of classical Latin and an analysis of its grammar and rhetoric became the model for foreign language study from the 17th to the 19th centuries. So because Latin it formed a crucial component of education in the Western world, the way Latin was traditionally taught became the model for teaching any foreign language. Okay, the difference is Latin is a written language. Well, it used to be a spoken language too, but now it's a written language. Yep, you can read Latin, you can write in Latin, but you no longer communicate orally in Latin in most cases. But it has formed the basis of how to teach any foreign language in the Western world. All right, and then we see the grammar translation method. Lessons are organized around grammar points, and each grammar point is listed with the rules and the rules explained with some examples illustrated by sample sentences. So what happens with grammar translation method? So this is so-called the traditional way of teaching a foreign language. You provide list of grammatical rules with examples, and the student has to memorize these rules. So this method, the grammar translation method, was heavily influenced by how Latin was taught in the Western world, especially during this period, 17th to 19th centuries. Okay, then we see the reform movement. People started seeing flaws in the grammar translation method, and then in opposition to the grammar translation method, the reform movement was born. It increased opportunities for communication, recognizing that Latin is not a spoken language, not anymore, but we need to emphasize oral communication for other languages. So yes, increased opportunities for communication among Europeans created a demand for oral proficiency in foreign languages. So let's say, if you just focus on Europe, let's say you're a French speaker, you're a native speaker of French, but you need to learn English to communicate with people in the UK. Or you need to learn German in order to go and live in Germany, for example. And then people started seeing that the grammar translation method wasn't very effective in teaching people how to actually communicate orally, so through speaking and listening. Okay. Language teaching specialists such as Marcel, Prendergast, and Going had done much to promote alternative approaches to language teaching, but their ideas failed to receive widespread support or attention. So let's see what these theorists, Marcel, Prendergast, and Going, argued for. Marcel referred to child language learning as a model for language teaching. So he focused on the way language development takes place in a child. Prendergast, on the other hand, was one of the first to record the observation that children use contextual and situational cues to interpret utterances, and that they use memorized phrases and routines in speaking. So both turn to how a child typically learns a language. Okay, and then Goen, he devised the so-called series method. So this method teaches directly, meaning without providing translation, and conceptually without grammatical rules and explanations. So this is different from the grammar translation method. A series of connected sentences that are easy to perceive. And as the name denotes, they are in a series or in a particular order. Let's have a look at this example here. So if you were learning, let's say English, using series method, you would have been taught sentences like these in this order. I walk towards the door. I draw near to the door. I draw nearer to the door. I get to the door. I stop at the door. I stretch out my arm, I take hold of the handle, I turn the handle, I open the door, I pull the door. Yeah, you see how these different actions are taking place in a series or in a particular order? Okay, and then there's the direct method. Members of the reform movement were interested in developing principles for language teaching out of naturalistic principles of language learning that we see in first language acquisition. People who supporters of the reform movement turn towards how people acquire their first language seemingly naturally. And this led to the natural methods, also referred to as the direct method. And believers of this method, the direct method, think that a foreign language could be taught without translation. So it's very obvious that there are a lot of critics who oppose the the grammar translation method, right? Or the use of learner's native language if meaning was conveyed directly through demonstration and action. So the direct method, proponents of the direct method were against using the students or the learner's first language. And then they also believed that translation in the learner's first language was not necessary. Okay, and this method depends on the teacher's skill. Yeah, so it puts a lot of emphasis on the teacher's role in teaching and learning a foreign language. But not all teachers were proficient enough. Critics pointed out that sometimes a simple, brief explanation in the student's native language, or L1, could have been a more efficient route to comprehension. Well, because proponents of this method were, as we just said, against using students' first language, the teacher had to explore various skills, maybe through actions, through lengthy explanations, to give a definition of, let's say, an object or a concept in the student's target language, to avoid giving any translation in the student's mother tongue. So we're now up to the methods era, which began from about the middle of the 20th century, and it continued up to about mid 1980s. Okay, let's have a look at some of the major methods that were developed during this era. There's the audiolingual method, which focused on oral skills, so oral, what you can listen, and oral, speaking, by mimicry memorization activities, so through repetition and memorizing techniques. And there was total physical response as well, which is teaching language through a lot of physical activities, believing that language acquisition and physical movements are closely related. The silent way, teachers wait until students figure out the language rules. So it's giving them some time to work out the language rules themselves, and giving students some right or freedom to remain silent until they're ready to speak. And there's also Suggestopedia, which capitalized on relaxed states of mind for maximum retention material using soothing music, which I think is a very interesting method as well. Okay, and there was also community language learning. I have to make sure I don't say communicative language teaching. They sound very similar. Which apply psychological counseling techniques in language teaching, and the natural approach, which uses comprehensible input or providing input that's not too difficult, something that students can actually understand, for triggering the acquisition of language. Okay, so there were criticisms that the direct method lacked a thorough methodological underpinning. Therefore, we saw the development of methods in this era, so-called the methods era. Okay, and then there's the post-method era from about mid-1980s. Okay, in this era, which has continued into the present or the contemporary era, present times, we see movements such as cooperative learning, which focuses on collaboration through group work, pair and group work, content-based learning, which is organized around the content or subject matter, such as history, social studies, or geography, math, and so on. So not just teaching, not treating English as a separate subject, but using the language to teach content areas such as history and social studies, task-based learning, using tasks as the core of planning and instruction in language and the lexical approach. Teaching words, chunks, and collocations, and treating them as the core of any language acquisition. And more recently, some educators have criticized the better-known approaches and methods as Western-centric. Well, the development of language teaching methodology has always been quite Western-centric because, well, I'm sure you can remember what I said about grammar translation method stemming from the way that Latin was taught in the Western world. Alternative ways of understanding the nature of language teaching have emerged. And after seeing the rise and fall of various methods, instead of having a new method, educators and educational theorists have come to agreement that we need to unify approaches to language teaching and design to design effective tasks and techniques informed by approaches. So in other words, rather than keep inventing or developing new methods because the previous one didn't work, what theorists and educators now believe is that, well, why don't we just look at the positive aspects, the pros of previous movements and just focus on what worked well and combine those rather than keep inventing new methods. Okay, here are review questions. Can you explain the definition of these terms, approach, method, and technique? We looked at different definitions provided by different educational theorists. So feel free to use any of those definitions, or you might actually want to come up with your own definition, combining different definitions that were introduced in today's class. Can you explain the brief history of approach? And have you ever experienced grammar translation instruction yourself? This is a traditional way of learning and teaching a foreign language. And it's been around in Korea for a long time. So the chances are you would have experienced grammar translation instruction method yourself. And what are the pros and cons of the approach? Did you enjoy grammar-based learning? What are some ways in which first and second language learning are similar? And in what ways are they different? So think about, I'm sure you were very, very young, very little when you first learned your first language, Korean. But if you can remember what it was like to learn your first language and then compare it with learning your second language, presumably English, then you can think about if there have been any similarities or differences that you have noticed. And that's it. These were the references that were used for today's class. Yep, if you can answer those review questions, then you did well today. Well done, you. Thank you.